Our story begins this evening on a PBY Catalina. A Catalina is an amphibious aircraft. You can see the wheels retracted there. This aircraft is designed to land on water as well as the land. And on this particular day, a Royal Navy Catalina was tasked to fly a clandestine mission from Britain to occupied territory. All preparations proceeded as normal until they were about between halfway and two-thirds through the flight. We're not exactly sure, but they came into some grief with some weather and the aircraft crashed. One of the most important details of this crash was the identity of one of the people on board this aircraft, Paymaster Lieutenant Turner, and some secret documents that he had in his pocket containing some classified information regarding an upcoming operation that the Allies had in mind. For the next few weeks, the British Armed Forces and the staff were very nervous because they knew that this aircraft had crashed in unfriendly territory. They knew that the documents carried by Lieutenant Paymaster Turner were incriminating evidence. And there's one thing that a general does not want to have in war, and that is for the enemy to get the plans. Halloween, October 31, 1942. As people were remembering this festival, a particular gentleman by the name of Flight Lieutenant Charles Chumley came up with an idea. He thought to himself, hey, wait a minute. If people in our country are so worried about documents falling into enemy hands, wouldn't it be really tricky if we planned it that way? And thus, Chumley outlined a plan. As it turned out, the documents that had fallen into enemy territory were in fact handed over to the Germans. However, the Germans didn't take the information too seriously because they suspected maybe it's a fraud, maybe this is a trick. On November 8, 1942, Operation Torch occurred, and you can see the details there on the screen, the invasion of North Africa. And it went according to plan. Churchill was very much relieved when he realized that his plan had not been torpedoed by these documents falling into enemy hands. But you might ask, what about Chumley's plan? What of the idea of planting documents on purpose into the hands of the enemy? Would they bite? It would have to be a clever deception. Would it be convincing enough to turn the tide of war? Speaking of war, there's been a great subject of interest and study for thousands of years. And if you happen to be a military strategist, you will recognize the picture on the screen without even me telling you the name. Sun Tzu is perhaps recognized as the master author, the master strategist, the master philosopher of waging war. And about 2,700 years ago, he created what has proven to be not only the first textbook, but also the current textbook for all serious military generals. From way back the time of Alexander the Great up to the present day, General David Petraeus of the US Army, they have all referred to Sun Tzu and taken his advice very seriously. Let me just read you a couple of excerpts from Sun Tzu's book, or his writing, his strategy. And by the way, he tells us this information is top secret. Civilians like you and me should not be reading this. So let's have a look. He says, war is the way of deception. And he goes through and lists a whole bunch of examples of what you should do when there is war. So when you are capable, appear to be incapable. When you are nearby, appear to be far away. When you are far away, appear to be very near. And he goes through detail after detail. You can read through it yourself. If you're strong, appear weak. If you're weak, appear strong. If your enemy appears to be confident, shake their confidence. If they think they're weak, make them feel they're strong. Do whatever you can to destabilize what their current point of view is. If they're expecting you, don't show up. If they're not expecting you, surprise them. That's his philosophy. What can we learn from this? Well, what I'm taking from this is the concept that war is really based on deception. We're going to have to look at some defining terms just briefly tonight to understand what warfare means, because obviously there can be different ways of having a conflict with somebody. We can have obviously warfare, combat, fighting, a struggle, an armed conflict, a military action, bloodshed, a tussle, a skirmish, a clash, an encounter, a collision, an attack. All kinds of words like this fall into the category, I think, of what Sun Tzu would say, let's trick the enemy. And the same with deception. Deception can come in all different shapes and sizes, but the whole point is to throw the enemy off our trail. If we can somehow help them think differently to what we're actually going to do, maybe that will give us an advantage. I'm suggesting tonight that if warfare exists, then deception must come along with it. Does that make sense? If there's warfare, there must be deception. I tried to think of an exception to that rule, and I couldn't think of any. You know, imagine if the enemy came to you and said, hey, guess what? In 27 and a half minutes' time, we're going to try and stab you in the back. You know, if you have the advance warning, you just walk away, right? Or arm yourself, or get a few mates to help you meet this attack. There's really, I can't think of any way to really wage war successfully if there's complete open transparency with the enemy well in advance. It wouldn't make sense, would it? So if deception is so important in war, then the real story must also be important for the people that want to be kept safe in this war. On April 30, 1943, after only 5 months of careful planning, Chumley had it executed. On the picture here you see a submarine from the Royal Navy, HMS Seraph, an S-class. It surfaced behind some unsuspecting fishing boats on the Spanish coast, and they had a carefully prepared package tailor-made for the enemy. A very elaborate hoax. A person who had passed away had been picked up from a morgue in England and been prepared to share a message with the enemy. The question was, would this decoy be handed over to the Germans? Of course, officially at that time, Spain was a neutral country. So officially, Spain was obligated to return deceased servicemen back to their homeland, in this case to the British. So there would be an expectation, at least on the outward appearance, that Spain would get this package back to England as soon as possible. But we also have a suspicion here behind the scenes that Spain and Germany had a little bit of relationship as well, so maybe there'd be a bit of checking out before the body went back. Let's find out what happens here. What do you think it would take to trick the enemy so that they would bite it? Last time when that Catalina went down, that was real documentation and it wasn't taken seriously. It was considered fraudulent. So how can we create a package that would in fact entice the enemy to bite? What would you do? Well, one of the first things that Chumley suggested was to create an ID. You need an ID for the person, right? So they spent some time taking photographs of various models to try and look like the person they were trying to invent. They had, of course, to make up a name for this person. One of the difficulties is that the body they got was not a very muscular person. He was quite scrawny and a bit older. And so the obvious question is, how would you help people think this is a legitimate military man if he's scrawny and older? So they ended up dressing him up as an administrator in an office, and that he'd been temporarily upgraded to a position of captain for the purposes of a secret mission. Of course, any real soldier needs a girlfriend, right? So they got a girlfriend, they got a lady who was working actually with the secret service, GCAS. They got her to pose as a fake girlfriend. She smiled at the beach with a towel, looking nice and beautiful. And of course, that was entered into his, to the wallet of this individual. They also created a letter, a fraudulent letter from an imaginary father who was writing to his son with some fairly terse advice. There was a hotel receipt placed into the pocket indicating that this man had recently been staying in London. Good little hint for the German intelligence. There was an engagement ring receipt in his pocket as well. And most importantly of all, there was a briefcase with secret documents. Hitler expected an upcoming invasion in Sicily, and it was very important for the enemy to learn about another potential invasion site. The question was, would this fake work? One question that came to mind was, well, what about the cause of death? No doubt the forensic experts, the medical professionals, they're going to have a look as well at this package. So they consulted with this gentleman here who was an expert and said, help us figure out what we need to do to make it look like the cause of death was what we would like to portray it as. Finally, they had to test ink. In those days, ink wasn't as advanced as it was today, and because this package would be in water for some days, the question was, well, how is the salt water going to affect the ink? Is it going to run? Is it going to fade? And of course, as they tried different inks, it did in fact not hold up under stress. So they had to actually locate and identify a quality brand of ink that would actually stay on the documents in the salt water for that period of time. The last question they needed to know was, how will we know if the package has been inspected? So into the envelope of the secret documents, they placed a single human eyelash. Everything went according to plan. The Spanish found this decoy and they forwarded everything to William Franz Canaris, head of the German military intelligence. They gave him an opportunity to inspect for about 24 hours before turning everything over to the British. Canaris was extremely careful because he didn't want the British to know that he had been tampering with the evidence. He made sure, he was so careful in fact, that even down to the sand and the buttonholes was left there to make sure it was still there when the British picked it up. He used a very thin metal rod to sneak into the envelope, carefully twisted up the documents that had been dampened, and gently, very gently pulled it out and inspected, photographed, put it all back in. He did such a wonderful job that when the British got everything back, they honestly didn't know if the documents had been tampered. In fact, they suspected maybe they haven't actually had a look at the documents. What would happen? Would the Germans believe the hoax? had they even gotten the information to begin with? Would the British find out that the Germans had tampered with the decoy? What would happen? How is that story going to play out? I just want to put a pause button there for just a minute and have a little think about how things work in the animal kingdom. We know that humans can be a bit deceptive, but what about animals? Are they any different? I've had some very interesting study on mimicry in the animal world. If you've had a chance to read about mimicry, mimicry is basically where an animal will impersonate somebody else or something else. And there's usually one of two reasons for this. The first type of mimicry is called aggressive mimicry. That's the wolf in sheep's clothing. The wolf wants to eat somebody else, but wants to appear to be harmless. That's the wolf in sheep's clothing. That's aggressive mimicry. The other kind of mimicry is called defensive mimicry. That's the sheep in wolf's clothes. The defensive mimic is worried about being eaten for lunch, and the defensive mimic wants to pretend that they are the wolf, even though they really are the sheep. Just recently, a friend of mine referred me to a radio show, ABC, On Drive with Richard Glover. This was 4 weeks ago today, actually. He interviewed Dr. Eliza Middleton from the University of Sydney, and she discusses animal mimicry in quite some depth. And she looks at examples on both sides, defensive and aggressive mimicry. You can see up on the screen here an example of, what do you think this one is? The anglerfish. Is this a defensive? Is this a wolf in sheep's clothing or a sheep in wolf's clothing? There's a sheep somewhere in the sentence. Is the sheep the subject, or is the sheep the object? This guy is going fishing. He's got a little, if you like, a rod in front of his face, dangling some what the prey hopes is bait. The animal comes to get what it thinks is food, but then the anglerfish says, "Thank you, I like fishing too. Welcome to my tummy." Another one here is called the pirate spider. The pirate spider is a mimic as well. He goes onto the web of another spider and he plays on the web at just the right frequency, as if he were the kind of insects that the other spider is hoping to eat. And as he dances on the web doing his little thing, the unsuspecting spider thinks, "Hey, here comes my lunch," comes out and becomes lunch for the pirate spider. But we also have examples of defensive mimicry. On the top there you can see the burrowing baby owl. The burrowing baby owl, I'm told, haven't tried this myself, but I'm told they make a delicious snack. But the burrowing baby owl doesn't want to be someone else's lunch. So when the threat approaches, the baby owl makes a sound like a rattlesnake. There is another creature called the wasp beetle. This creature, according to Dr. Eliza Middleton on that radio show, she said this is a very juicy snack for a lot of predators, but when they see a wasp, or what they think is a wasp, they leave the thing alone. Also here in Australia, we have the Australian death adder and its friend, the Jackie dragon. Now the Jackie dragon likes to go looking for its food by tuning itself into a couple of specific frequencies and vibrations. And the Australian death adder has learned what kind of frequencies the Jackie dragon's looking for. So as the Jackie dragon goes out for its lunch, the death adder says, "I'm going to play some vibrations." The Jackie dragon hears those vibrations and says, "Oh goody, lunchtime." And the Australian death adder says, "Yep, you got that one right." One more example. This one here is an alligator snapping turtle. There should be an animation going here, hopefully. Look at the tongue very carefully. The tongue is wiggling around backwards and forwards as if to say, "Come and get dinner." Right into my mouth. The Bible talks about war in heaven. We've been talking about or thinking about Sun Tzu, but it seems like if there really is war, there may also be deception. Let's have a look at that. It says this: "Then there was war in heaven. Michael and his angels fought against the dragon and his angels. The dragon lost the battle, and he and his angels were forced out of heaven. This great dragon, the ancient serpent called the devil or Satan, the one deceiving the whole world, was thrown down to earth with all his angels." Now, some of you might be thinking, I don't believe that. That's just a mythical kind of a writing from some funny religious book. And if you want to think that for a minute, that's fine. But the question I'd be asking you to ponder with me is, if this is really a trick, then what's that war? Where did that war come from to make this trick up? What's the point of deception if there is no need to deceive anybody? What is the point of deception if everybody is at peace? But wait, I can hear what you might be thinking. Maybe you're saying, you know what, the whole animal kingdom is just dog eat dog. Everything's about survival of the fittest. There's nothing special about deception. There's nothing special about fighting because everybody does it, right? Right? Is it true? Does everybody chase and kill everybody? Well, let's think about that one. Is striving and competition the only game in town? Think about it carefully with me for a minute. Is survival of the fittest the only thing you see in nature? I'd like to introduce you to something very, very interesting. This comes from the American Journal of Primatology, and what you can see on the screen there is a mum, a capuchin female carrying the infant of a marmoset. These animals aren't even in the same genus. And this other picture, there's two pictures there, shows the mum actually caring for and breastfeeding the child of another genus. For the first time, this is another article here, for the first time scientists have seen dolphins adopt an orphan from another species. And I just went through looking at examples. Let me just list some for you. An old tortoise picked up and protected and provided shelter for a baby hippo. A sperm whale pod adopted a deformed dolphin. A Dalmatian ended up caring for a lamb. A wild boar took care of a monkey. And a wild cat, this is not a domesticated cat, a wild cat is taking care of a baby rabbit. A husky looking after a baby meerkat. And this picture struck me the most. I haven't got it on the screen for you, but I saw a picture of a lioness looking after a baby antelope. A lioness looking after a baby antelope. And there are other examples too. In fact, it's so interesting and pervasive to provide a counterbalance to the survival of the fittest. They've actually coined a term for it. It's called altruism. Altruism in nature. Evolutionary altruism. Walruses adopt orphans. Humpback whales protect other species from sharks. Let me just share this from a journal to you. Some behaviors appear to increase the fitness of other individuals at the expense of the fitness of the individual carrying out the behavior. When a behavior has this feature, it is said to be an instance of evolutionary altruism. It is important to distinguish, he says, between evolutionary altruism from psychological altruism. And he goes on to explain psychological altruism is where there is intent. It was actually on purpose, as opposed to like a tree or a shrub that's just sort of existing and happens to benefit other species. But think about that now. We've got the natural world fighting amongst itself, but not exclusively. Some are fighting, some are protecting. Some are taking advantage of other people or other animals, other creatures. Others are self-sacrificing for the good of others. Why would that be? Brian Garvey, I just quoted a moment ago, says, creatures with sufficiently sophisticated psychology could be psychologically altruistic. Well, there's an idea I didn't think of. And gives humans as the main example of exhibiting this evolutionary psychological altruism. So we get the prize, yay. But that's still giving us the question, why? What's the point? What's the purpose? What's the benefit? What's in it for me if I'm helping somebody else that isn't related to me, that doesn't give me anything back? If I die in the process of helping some other species out, what's the point of that? I want to introduce you to one more example. This is now a cell, an altruistic cell. This particular cell is one that normally lives by itself, but when times get tough, when the food sources are reduced, these cells clump together for survival. And some, it's kind of hard to imagine how this works, but some lay down their lives so that the other cells can survive. If they don't do this, everybody dies, but some of these cells lay down so that others can make it. There's a bit of a picture of a life cycle here you can see of this particular cell. It's a very, very interesting, beautiful, some of these genomics professors are saying, a very mathematical example of beauty, they say, in the natural world. What on earth's going on? How about the human experience? Are all humans the same? Do we all have the same priorities, the same values? Do we all treat each other the same way? Obviously not. Back in World War II, we had a red poster here. I don't know if you can read the words on the screen there. The red poster is a German warning. This is at the time of the Warsaw Ghetto in Poland, and it basically says there's an epidemic that's being spread. We need to control this epidemic by making sure that all the Jews stay inside that compound. Anybody that escapes the punishment is death. Anybody that helps anybody escape that ghetto, the punishment for them too is death. Some humans are putting up messages like this and enforcing them, but at the same time, we have somebody like this particular young lady, Irene Sendler, who was a nurse who ended up going into the ghetto and smuggling babies out. She risked her life to save people she didn't even know so that they could get out and break the very sign that some of her fellow species had created. So you can see in the human world, as well as in the animal kingdom, even at the cellular level, we have, it seems, competing interests. Some are looking out for themselves, some are sacrificing themselves for the benefit of another. What does that tell you? If you were a thinking person and saw this kind of data, what would you conclude? What would you think? This is what the Bible says. In the beginning of the Bible, it has this: you and the woman, this is talking to the serpent, the snake, Satan, you and the woman will hate each other. Your descendants and hers will always be enemies. One of hers will strike you on the head, and you will strike him on the heel. At the very end of the Bible, using what I believe to be some very significant symbolic language, this war again is a focal point. When the dragon realized that he had been thrown down to earth, he pursued the woman who had given birth to the male child. The dragon was angry at the woman and declared war against the rest of her children, all who keep God's commandments and maintain their testimony in Jesus. So it seems from beginning to end in the Bible, there's a concept there of warfare. There's a concept there that there are two sides, two competing interests, one opposed to the other. Maybe you're thinking it sounds far-fetched. What is the evidence for a situation like this? Well, let's have a look. When I was a child, I grew up in the Solomon Islands, and on the screen here you see a picture of a truck. I could be corrected on this, but this looks like it might be some kind of a water or fuel, or it's got some reels there for some hoses on the back of that truck. I used to have a great time after school going onto the battlefields in Guadalcanal, pretending that I was some brave soldier driving a truck or holding the barrel of some big gun. It was fun to imagine being in a war, but it was only fun because I wasn't really there. If I'd actually been in that war, I'm pretty sure the fun would have evaporated. What does a war zone look like? How did I know that this was a war zone? What's the clue? How can I tell? Well, as I walked around the battlefield, there was evidence all around. I had pieces of bullets and shrapnel. There were bits and pieces of broken vehicles and equipment. And of course, if I'd gone closer to the actual event, I would have seen human carnage as well. When we are in war, perhaps one of the best clues is carnage. Now, obviously, from a skeptical position, you can say, well, carnage happens all the time. We get a big tsunami, widespread carnage. A big earthquake, pitiless indifference, a whole bunch of carnage happens. But I'm talking about a specific kind of carnage tonight. I'm talking about what I will call differentiated carnage. That means there's some problems over here, but over here it's peaceful and quiet. Over here is a botanical garden with thousands of international tourists having a wonderful Sunday afternoon picnic, and over here is literally a war zone. If it really was pitiless indifference, wouldn't it be the same everywhere? Wouldn't it be widespread carnage or widespread botanical gardens? The fact that we see pockets going around tells us, the bubbling and boiling tells us, I suggest, one fingerprint, forensic evidence that maybe we have a war. In fact, I have an atheist friend of mine who sends me emails on a regular basis, and he makes great pains to tell me from his background all of the differentiated carnage that he sees in the world. He and I have totally different worldviews, but he's the one telling me what he sees. I find that very interesting. How about another fingerprints from war? Well, we've seen that we have competing values. We have in the animal kingdom and also in the human realm, some people looking out for themselves, for their own best interests, and others who are willing to self-sacrifice for the interests of others. How about contradictory truth claims? There are so many different statements being called out in the world today. Some say there was no beginning of the universe. That's kind of a minor view these days. Or other people say, in the beginning there was nothing. Other people say, in the beginning God created. Some people say God is a megalomaniac, or other very derogatory terms, and other people say, no, God is love. Do these terms tell us something? Are we all at peace? Are we all on the same page? Do we all have the same perspective? Or are we caught up in some kind of a conflict where there is a war of ideas, where there is a true story and a false story? What do you think the fingerprints point to? When I was a bit younger, one of my highly respected professors came to me posing a perspective that every viewpoint is subjective. That could be an escape today. Well, Nathan, there's all the different views, but every single view is subjective. That view can be for you, this view can be for you, that view can suit you. All views basically pick your flavour and go with it. The trouble is, the question that the second person might ask is your viewpoint subjective as well? You know, if someone tells me, Nathan, every view is subjective, they just pointed their finger at me and told me an absolute statement, did they not? If they're being subjective, as Dr. Pandit pointed out a few nights ago, it's a self-refuting statement. You can't pick yourself up by your own bootstraps. It causes problems when we say everything is relative and preach it as if it's the gospel truth. Maybe that is relative as well, and then we're just in a big circle of meaninglessness. Then I saw a beast rising up out of the sea. It had 7 heads and 10 horns, with 10 crowns on its horns, and written on each were names that blasphemed God. What does it mean to blaspheme God? Well, it can mean a few different things, but the basic concept is if I'm blaspheming, I'm taking on the authority, the power that rightfully belongs to somebody else, and I say, no, no, I am in charge. I am the captain, like the mutiny of a ship. You walk the plank, Mr. Bligh, the captain. I'm the new guy in charge around here. Even if it doesn't eventuate the threat or the plan of it, that is normally considered treason. And according to the Bible, there is this kind of a tension going on. There are two sides competing, two sides warring with each other, or one side at least warring against another side. The whole world, it says here, worship the dragon for giving the beast such power, and they also worship the beast. Who is as great as the beast, they exclaimed. Who is able to fight against him? Then the beast was allowed to speak great blasphemies against God. The point I want to focus on there is the part at the bottom. There's a conflict here against God. That's the focus. That's the push. What's the reason for these competing truth claims if there really is no war? Does it make sense to make this up if everything really is at peace? If there really is no conflict, what would be the point of this? What would it be trying to achieve? Let's look at a fourth fingerprint, that of intentional deception. It seems that all around us, we agree that deception is widespread. We have a banana that tells us that it's right, but we also have a telemarketer telling us that we have a great deposit just waiting to go into our bank account. How do we navigate this? How do we ensure that we aren't going to be tricked? Can you think of any good reason for these fingerprints other than war? What else could it be if it isn't war? We'll just spend a few moments looking back at how the Bible talks about the beginning of this war, and I want to jump back into our story, and I've got a second surprise for you as well. Then I saw another beast come up out of the earth. He required all the earth and its people to worship the beast whose fatal wound had been healed. He did astounding miracles, even making fire to come down from the sky while everyone was watching. And with all the miracles he was allowed to perform on behalf of the first beast, he deceived who? It says everybody. All of us are liable here if we're not very careful. And if you remember the first night that we spoke together on Periander and the magic tricks, signs and wonders, miraculous things happening in the sky, that's great, but that's not as impressive as predicting the future, is it? That's not as impressive as this text here saying it'll happen before it actually happens. Isn't that the greater amazement? So according to the Bible, just recapping, God has an adversary whose principles go directly against him. God's adversary tries to deceive the world. Truth becomes a casualty, and people suffer as a result. That's why this matters to me. If people didn't suffer, we could just say, oh, it's just an intellectual exercise, let's go home and do something else. But the fact that people suffer, that's why you and I care. That's why I care about this one. Do you see signs of warfare around you? Am I making this up? Is it just coincidental that we have fingerprints, those 4 fingerprints of differentiated carnage, of this idea of deception and the idea of covering up things that would otherwise be plainly seen? What else makes sense? But remember, if war is a reality, then what's our conclusion? If there really is a war, what's the necessary corollary to that? What follows as a result of war? Well, it tells us if war is in view, then we know that deception must also be the base for it. If war is a reality, then things may not be as they seem. 2 nights ago, we had a look at Eric Nave, the Australian codebreaker. And I want to just share a brief story that we didn't cover on Monday that belongs in tonight's time together. In April 1942, Eric our Aussie codebreaker intercepted a top-secret travel itinerary for the very highly respected Admiral Yamamoto. He was Admiral of the Imperial Navy. There's some debate about who gets the credit for deciphering that message, but what I can tell you for sure is that this code was used to create a very audacious, very secret interception mission. This picture you see is the back end of a P38 Lightning. This is a very special aircraft, very unusual. You can see by the picture it looks unusual. Two 1,200 horsepower V12 Allison engines built on contract from Rolls-Royce. This aircraft, when it flies, it roars. The unique feature of this aircraft is its range. At this time in the war, most aircraft would have a combat radius of between maybe 100 to 200 miles. If you got more than that with drop tanks, you were doing very well. The mission called for a 1,000-mile round trip. This was a very, very unique mission. 16 of the very best pilots and aircraft were assembled. The day before the mission was to proceed, a compass from a naval ship was brought to the airstrip and installed in the lead aircraft. They couldn't just use a generic small aviation compass. They needed a big, proper naval compass. They flew at 30 feet above the waves and timed their mission to absolute perfection. They arrived there, depending upon the accounts you read, either dead on time or 1 minute early. So let's say, split the difference and say they got there 30 seconds early after flying for 2.5 hours, no GPS, just the compass from the Navy ship and the stopwatch. They arrived right on time. From the perspective of the guys flying this aircraft, that mission went according to plan. And then there was silence. 4 weeks, 5 weeks, nobody heard anything. The code breakers didn't want anyone to know that they had intercepted the code. They didn't want anybody to know that they'd planned a mission. They didn't want anybody to know that it was intentional, that they had succeeded. They wanted everybody to think it was a coincidence. And 5 weeks later, this, on May 21, 1943, is what appeared on the headlines. Allies destroy 113 planes in Italian raids. And then there's a little, sort of a less important subnote, just a little second story there. And it just says, Yamamoto, and it's got a little subtitle there. He's basically been reported as a casualty. This is a zoom in of that very same newspaper. You see the date there, May 21, 1943. And look at the red box there. A Tokyo radio announcer, in a voice which broke with emotion, gave the news to the Japanese people with these words from the official Japanese announcement. And then it says what happened. So according to this newspaper, where did the intelligence come from? New York, but where did the New York people get it from? From the Tokyo radio announcer. According to the newspaper, the Tokyo radio announcer was the first person to give the Americans any idea what had happened 5 weeks ago in Bougainville. That's not all. Look at the column there. Presumably, the very front lines of the South referred to the waters of North Australia, in New Guinea or the Solomon Islands. Yeah, a bit of a stab in the dark. It must have happened somewhere over there. We Americans don't know because, you know, we weren't expecting it. American communiques recorded the following air or sea actions during April. And the newspaper goes and lists a whole bunch of other events they claim happened in this place and time, but they don't mention the one that happened on April 18, because according to the American point of view, it didn't actually happen. It says here, Yamamoto may have died, perhaps the victim of some youthful American fighter who had no idea he was sending the enemy's top commander to his death. It must have been a coincidence. It must have been a complete accident. On the right is the military citation given by the US president to the guy who led that mission. Compare the newspaper article to the presidential citation. Major John Mitchell, and you can see the highlighting there, there is his name. It says that he flew dangerously low altitude in the longest planned interception mission ever attempted, with complete tactical surprise, with full appreciation of the technical accuracy required for the achievement of this vital mission. And at the end, his actions were in keeping with the highest traditions of the United States. You tell me, is there trickery and deception going on here? Was it really just a coincidence that the events of April 18 unfolded and then appeared in the newspaper very differently 5 weeks later? Is that interesting at all? Does that impact us in any way? Thank you, thank you. Let's go back now to the story of the British planting that decoy to finish our time off tonight. Indeed, Hitler was completely tricked. On May 14, 1943, the Admiral Karl Dönitz met Hitler, and this is what is recorded. It says this: "The Führer," that's Hitler, "does not agree with Mussolini," that's his Italian comrade, "that the most likely invasion point is Sicily. Furthermore, he believes that the discovered Anglo-Saxon order confirms the assumption that the planned attacks will be directed mainly against Sardinia and the Peloponnesus, which is in Greece." Believing the fake intelligence found on the planted body, Hitler began removing troops and equipment from Sicily. And you can see there is a picture there, a space photo of what happened. So Sicily is in the bottom right-hand corner of your screen, and Hitler, thinking he had decoded the tricks of the enemy, got all of his troops and put them there, and also on the other end, about 150 miles to the west of Sicily. So he basically had his troops split both directions away from Sicily because he felt that the intelligence pointed that that was going to be happening. He informed his ally Mussolini that Greece and Sardinia must be defended at all costs. He doubled the number of troops in Sardinia. He sent fighter aircraft there for support. 2 of his top panzer divisions were moved to the Balkans. The German torpedo boats were moved away from Sicily to the Greek islands. More troops were also sent to Greece. Clearly, Hitler believed the intelligence discovered on the decoy that Chumley's team had planted. But the question is, would the British find out that they had tampered with the evidence? As the British carefully analysed the returned decoy, they could find no evidence of tampering. There was no indication that the Germans had been playing with their evidence until they opened the envelope and they found one detail missing. The human eyelash was missing. On July 9, the Allies invaded Sicily, Operation Husky. The German signals were intercepted by GC and CS. This is the guys that Eric Nave, our guy, worked for 2 nights ago. Eric's colleagues discussed the details. They showed that even 4 hours after the invasion had commenced, the German forces were still leaving Sicily to go to the other locations, thinking that Sicily was the decoy. Hitler was still convinced that an attack on Greece was imminent, and in late July he sent Erwin Rommel to Salonika to prepare the defences of the region. By the time the German High Command realised the mistake, it was too late to make a difference. Churchill eagerly tracked the developments. Finally, GC and CS gave him the message he was looking for. Mincemeat, that's the name of the operation. Operation Mincemeat swallowed hook, line and sinker. How does it impact you and me if we are tricked? How does it play out in our realm, in our life? Well, I'm wondering that if we are being deceived, it is much easier for us to fall prey to something that we do not expect. Maybe we could be overpowered or assailed in some way. The Bible warns us, stay alert, watch out for your great enemy, the devil. He prowls around like a roaring lion, looking for someone to devour. So what's your eyelash? How do you determine what is true? What is the real story and what is the cover story? And that Admiral Yamamoto, of course, there were two versions of the story. There was the true story, the citation the president gave to the crew, and then there was the newspaper, the cover story. Which story are you reading? Or if you've got two stories on your plate, how do you figure out which one is which? I think this is an important question to ask, and it kind of plays into the last few presentations we've had. We had a look, number one, about periander and the idea of magic, the importance of predicting the future accurately before it happens. We also had a look at number two, the importance of code breaking. You know, there's a very interesting book written by Isaac Newton, a very well-known physicist from a few hundred years ago. He actually wrote a book totally focused on Bible prophecy. And I would encourage you, if you haven't already read this book, to have a look at it. I'll just point out a couple of quotes in this particular page for you tonight. He says, God gave the Old Testament prophecies to confirm the protective care to the whole world, not to gratify idle curiosities, nor to stroke egos of religious interpreters. That's a bit of a warning for us, isn't it? He furthermore goes on to say that for as the few and obscure prophecies concerning Christ's first coming were set up for the Christian religion, which all nations have since corrupted, so the many and clear prophecies concerning the things to be done at Christ's second coming are not for the predicting, but also for effecting a recovery and a re-establishment of a long-lost truth, and setting up a kingdom wherein dwells righteousness. The event will prove the book of Revelation, and this prophecy thus proved and understood will open the old prophets and altogether will make known true religion and establish it. So from Newton's perspective, one way to check your eyelash out is to have a look at these books. That's what Newton recommended. We've got to keep in mind here that if there is a war, there is going to be a contest, a trickery. It says this in Revelation 13, he did astounding, this is the enemy, he did astounding miracles, even making fire flash down to earth from the sky while everyone was watching. And with all miracles he was allowed to perform on behalf of the first beast. He deceived all the people who belonged to this world. He ordered the people to make a great statue of the first beast who was fatally wounded and then came back to life. It's a bit cryptic, it's a bit enigmatic, but I think we can say in broad brushstrokes, there's clearly a contest here, and it's about deception. But I have a promise or a hope as we finish up tonight. You know, it could be overwhelming to be in a place of conflict and war, and maybe you're thinking, I don't know if I can cope with this. I don't know if I can manage. God's got a promise here. In James, he says, humble yourselves before God, resist the devil, and he will. It's a promise. He will flee from you. Come close to God, and God will come close to you. Wash your hands, you and me, doers of wrong. Let us all together purify our hearts, humble ourselves before the Lord, and he will lift us up in honor. There's a promise there. There's a protection. There is an enemy, a roaring lion, but there is also the God of the universe, the Father we saw last night who loves us. This is the God who wants to keep us safe. He has promised to look after us. he is as solid as a rock. We've come to the conclusion of our presentation tonight. We've got a couple of scales there, and there's obviously two ways this could go. And I recognise that we come from different backgrounds and perspectives, and that's fine. I just encourage you to think about the evidence we've looked at tonight, or maybe you want to ask some questions, maybe in a few moments here. What makes more sense to you? Are we really at peace? Is everything just normal and sporadic and random? Is the conflict just widespread and universal because nature just is that way? Or are we really in a differentiated conflict? Are we really in a position to see competing warring sides, not just at the cellular level, not just in the animal kingdom, but also in the human experience, and by extension, possibly even the supernatural experience? If there really is a war, then, ladies and gentlemen, I think there could be deception. But thank God we have a counterintelligence unit working on our side. Thank you very much. Happy to take written questions if you have written questions. If you have oral questions, I'll do my best with those as well. If you interested, if you want to stretch or you need to leave or want to leave, that's fine too, but I'm happy to do my best if you've got anything on your mind.
I remember about that decoy information they gave us, believing the fellow that got locked up.
Oh, Operation Mincemeat, yes.
They actually made a film of that.
Oh, is that right? Have you had a chance to see that one?
Yeah, I see it. Black and white, probably made it early 50s up.
Okay.
It was called The Man Who Never Was.
The Man Who Never Was, Michael Goiter. They actually have a tombstone in, is it in Spain, is it? Or, I forget where the tomb is, but they actually have this inscription to the guy's name, and then I think in the 60s or 70s, when the story came out publicly, they actually had to chisel and modify the, the gravestone to actually identify him as who served as so-and-so. Yes?
Are you the brother of Warren?
Brother of Warren. I don't know a Warren, I'm sorry. I got a few mates, Warren. Am I waiting for questions? I'm happy to wait if there are some questions coming. I don't want to hurry anybody, but I don't want to make you feel like you're obliged to stay either. So happy to take a question or two if you have one. If I've covered everything or they're all sorted, that's great. It is a little bit heavy. It's a little bit counterintuitive. I think for a lot of people, the idea of conflict in the supernatural realm kind of seems either imaginary, like a fairy tale. It can't possibly be that there's any supernatural realm. Some of my friends fall in that category. Others of my friends say, yeah, I believe in the supernatural realm, but everything up there is my friend, right? There's no evil side out there. And I'm hoping the point tonight was, well, I think I've given 4 good fingerprint evidences of a war zone, and if there are 4 fingerprint evidences for a war zone, then it's reasonable to suspect that deception is an important part of that war zone. If in fact we do have a war zone and deception, my question for us is, did we get the real story, or did we get what we call the cover story, the story that covers the real story? That was the point tonight. I hope that came across clear. Well, thank you very much, everybody. Happy to chat privately as well.